Hello friends, you may have not heard me the first minute or so. I'm starting over again. Welcome to another episode of the Bhagavad Gita. We are at the very last stretch of this journey that I began almost in the beginning of this pandemic last year. And today we are going to start with the 18th chapter, which is in a sense one of the most important chapters of the Gita because Krishna does consciously summarize a lot of things for us in this chapter and also has a lot of punchlines with which he ends this entire scripture. Last week we looked at the 17 and now we are moving on to the 18, and I'm planning to do this week and next one on the 18th chapter, and that will be a finale for this series. I'm going to, as always, start with a piece of music. As you may have already noticed, the topic that we are going to discuss today is the caste system. And of course, there's a lot of spiritual implications to it. We are not talking about caste that is based on heredity or parentage, but more of the spiritual reality that is essential for us to understand how we function in this world. And this song has a story, which I'll come to just in a bit. But I'm going to present for you an Indian song written by a famous saint named Kanakadasa. And we'll start with that, and then I'll read my verse for today. Baro Krishnaya Ninna Bhaktara Manegiga Baraya Baro Krishnaya Ninna Bhaktara Manegiga Baraya Baro Krishnaya Baro Ninna Mukha Toro Baro Ninna Mukha Toro Ninna Sariyaro Jagadala Shilane Baro Ninna Mukha Toro Ninna Sariyaro Jagadala Shilane Baro Krishnaya Anduge padagavu kalanduge kiruge je dim dimi 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 kenuta Anduge padagavu kalanduge kiruge je dim dimi 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 kenuta Pongolala nuduta Baraya Pongolala nuduta Baraya Pongolala nuduta Baraya Baro Krishnaya Ninna Bhaktara Manegiga Baraya Baro Manegige Baro Manegige Baro Krishnaya This beautiful song calls to Krishna to come to the poet, the saint that wrote this song. Let's now just take a brief moment of silence, meditating on that form of the divine as Krishna coming to us, entering our hearts. Om. Good morning again, friends. So I'll first read the verse for today. As I was saying, we are going to discuss caste system from the 18th chapter. I cannot believe we waited this long to discuss this concept. And of course, this concept itself does not find a mention until the very last part of the Gita. The verse that I'm going to share with you is verse 41 from chapter 18. As always, I'll first read the Sanskrit verse and then we will read Swami Kriyananda's translation of it. This is how the verse sounds. Brahmana kshatriya visham shudra namcha parantapa karmani pravibhaktani Svabhava prabhavair gunaihi. And the English translation of this verse. O Scorcher of Foes, Arjuna, the duties of Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, as also of Shudras, are according to the gunas uppermost in their natures. So, I want to start with the song that I just sang for you. I said there's a story behind the song, so I have to first start there, lest I don't have time if I go into other concepts and explanations of the caste system itself. But even before I do that, I think it's rather self-evident, if not already obvious to all of you watching this. The caste system that Krishna is talking about here, although often misinterpreted by many commentaries on Gita, by many that are that even stand against Sanatana Dharma of India and consider it a way of social oppression. This caste system that we are talking about has very little to do with heredity or parentage or one's birth. As Swami Kriyananda explains in one of his other books, the caste system is a universal reality. So it is not to say that it is against the idea of social equality or anything like that. Of course, there's a lot of socio-political issues which we are not going to be getting into in this particular setting. There's a lot of other realities to it. In fact, I think Yogananda ji, these were his exact words. He said, every country has its own misery-making karma. And he said, one of India's misery-making karma is the caste system itself and the social inequalities that it has led to. So there is no endorsement of the way things have unfolded over the last centuries and the reason to have social justice and all of that. That's not at all what we are talking about here. What we are discussing is the universal reality of human nature. And this discussion itself is naturally follows the discussion of the gunas, which we will see in a bit. But I'll go back to the story, which demonstrates this point, which is demonstrated not just in India, but by saints and religions and cultures across the world. Of course, one's own relationship to God and whether one can be a saint or not is never defined by one's birth. Saints are born in all kinds of settings. They're warriors, they're poor people, they're rich people, they're born in the family of priests, they're born in the family of hunters. Every profession you can imagine, you can find Christian saints, Hindu saints, Sufi saints. You can find saints of all traditions having found their place in some different socio-cultural economic setting. And almost I feel God makes it so that way to show us that none of these settings in themselves are limiting to our relationship with the divine. We can spiritualize and find our way to God no matter where we find ourselves, socioeconomically, of course. Caste defined by birth is not as significant a limitation as it is today as it was centuries ago. Now, going back to the story, the song that I shared with you was written by a saint named Kanakadasa. I'm not quite sure about the exact time. I'm going to assume perhaps 500, 600 years ago during the peak of the Bhakti movement in India, the revival of the Bhakti tradition. And this was written in a sacred town in South India called Udupi. And Kanakadasa himself was born in a very low caste, but he was a deep devotee of the Lord. And the story, goes on to say that he traveled a very long distance to see Krishna, the idol of Krishna, in this small temple town called Udupi in South India. And when he came, there was so much orthodoxy and there was just this bureaucratic priesthood managing this temple that they wouldn't allow him to even see the Lord, to have darshan of the deity because he was of the low caste. So, of course, Kanakadasa is very, very distraught and he's very disappointed that he has come this far and he's not able to see Krishna. And just on the streets of Udupi, he starts composing and singing songs and he's crying and yearning to see the Lord. And as the story is told, he's just standing outside the temple, just disappointed and distraught at not being able to see Krishna. And as he is singing and singing, it is said that the deity, which was facing the eastern direction, turned westward, and the face of the deity turned westward, and there was a crack in the temple wall, and through that, now since the deity had turned, Kanakadasa could actually see Krishna. And the very first time he saw this idol of Krishna, when he got to have darshan, he goes into a state of samadhi, he goes into the state of ecstasy, just in his consciousness being united with Krishna. And in fact, even today, if you were to visit this small temple town, nobody can enter the temple through the eastern gate or through the main gate at all. Everybody sees Krishna through that hole through which Kanakadasa saw Krishna many, many years ago. And there is a small window that has been constructed there, and that's how you see Krishna, perhaps in the hopes that we would also experience that same state of bliss that Kanakadasa experienced when he had that darshan for the very first time. I share the story because, of course, there are so many, many stories from the Indian scriptures, but also from real instances of saints over the past centuries, of those that were born in various lower castes, but were, of course, they were higher than the highest Brahmins because they were united with the Lord. So when we talk of caste system, we are talking about one's own consciousness and where we are vibrating, how we are resonating. And as I was starting to say, this concept of the caste system naturally follows the discussion on the gunas, because as Krishna explains here, without any space for misinterpretation, because I guess one could foresee that this teaching could be misinterpreted. These words in Sanskrit, he says, as I was reading that Sanskrit verse, I think he says Svabhava prabhavaihi. What that means is, by one's own nature, he makes it very clear that this is not heredity. What we are talking about is not based on birth. And as Swami explains that, it is based on the gunas uppermost in one's own nature. That's how these four castes are defined. And we will see later on in the Gita, I think in verse 47, let me read that verse as well. Yes, it is verse 47 where Krishna says, "It is better to fail attempting to follow one's own dharma than to succeed in following the dharma of another. One incurs no sin in trying to fulfill his own duty." So this concept, as Krishna states here, is very important. It's not one that is trivial or just something that somebody came up with. Krishna goes on to say that it is better to fail attempting to do one's own dharma according to his caste, rather than being even perfect in somebody else's dharma, because we don't spiritually progress by doing somebody else's duty. We can only grow by doing our own spiritual duty. So it behooves us to understand this in the right context, so we can relate to this world in terms of what the Dharma is that Krishna is talking about, and how do we relate it to our own spiritual progress. Now, of course, I'll start with the explanation of the four castes themselves. In case you're not familiar with it, the four castes that Krishna is talking about in the verse that I read were Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Now, of course, these are Sanskrit words. I'm going to try to replace these Sanskrit words with English words that are approximate in their meaning. So, it's a little more real and practical for those of you that are listening. Let's call the Brahmins the sages. And I'm going to read verse 42 of the Gita. I'm going to read the English translation, where Krishna says, "The inherent duties of a Brahmin, the inherent duties of a sage, are mind control, sense control, self-restraint, purity, forgiveness, integrity, meditation to attain self-realization, and faith in a higher truth." Now, the Brahmin caste, the sage that we are referring to here, is one whose consciousness is so completely steeped in sattva, in that pure, elevating, uplifting quality, that there is no rajas or tamas in his nature. There is no downward pulling or ego activating tendencies. A Brahmin has conquered all of this. And typically in India, this word is even often translated as priest, which I'm not quite fond of. But let's just call the Brahmin sages. A Brahmin is someone in his own consciousness, not by birth. In his own consciousness, a Brahmin is somebody who is always in attunement with the divine will, whose thoughts and actions are constantly guided by his own connection with a higher reality. So faith and meditation and pranayam and all these things are just second nature to his own self, because these are all things that naturally that he's drawn to as he finds himself more and more in tune with the divine. Now I'm going to move on and let's talk about the Kshatriyas. The natural duties of a Kshatriya are valor, vigor, fortitude, resourcefulness, skill in action, standing up firmly to the enemy, munificence, and leadership. A Kshatriya is also a very, very noble soul. A Kshatriya is also sattvic essentially in nature, but there is also a predominant rajasic aspect to his own self. So he is working with gunas that are all taking him towards a higher state. Now the difference between a Brahmin and a Kshatriya, of course, let's call a Kshatriya the warrior. The warrior itself is a very powerful and a very useful image on the spiritual life. Yogananda ji often used that symbol of a warrior in many of his poems and writings and prayers. And we use the word spiritual warrior even to talk about somebody who has the courage to embrace a serious spiritual life. Now, the essence of being a warrior is simply that somebody is able to place their principles over anything else. Somebody is able to use their principles as a motivation to do the right thing and not driven as much by self-interest. That's the definition of warrior. Just think about it. A warrior, of course, we live in a world where there is warfare and all of the other things that define conflict, but not in the sense that it existed in stories and scriptures. We don't actually go to the battlefield. We don't actually walk with bows and arrows or attack somebody physically. That's not the world we live in. We are in a much more refined age. But if you think about it, think about a warrior who actually goes on to the battlefield. A warrior is somebody who is willing to give up his own life for the sake of his country or the sake of whatever he believes in. Now, if you just contemplate on that, how important is that gift of life? How precious it is. It is, in fact, everything that we want to safeguard with every cell of our own being. And for somebody to be able to sacrifice his own life, he has to place his principles and his beliefs above everything else. And that's what defines a warrior. To a warrior, even his own life is only secondary, in comparison to protecting or living by the principles that he believes in. That sense of personal integrity defines the warrior, self-righteousness and the nobility and refinement that comes by living for truth alone. That is what defines a warrior. And as I was saying, we may not be living in a world where we march into battlefields or we actually take on enemies. Of course, there are still, there's military and all the other branches of it where people actually embrace a life where they have to take up arms and such. I'm not talking about that. Perhaps fair to assume that most of you who are watching this are not ones that are planning to go to a battlefield. And this idea of a warrior and of being a Kshatriya is equally relevant to us, although our realities might be different. As I was saying, this idea of a spiritual warrior in itself is this attribute of being a Kshatriya. In fact, this is something that some of you may have heard. Paramhansa Yogananda often shared with his disciples that he himself was William the Conqueror. And I did not grow up, learning a lot about William the Conqueror. It was not part of the education that I received in India. But I'm told that if you went through Western schooling, you do not have necessarily a good or a very pleasant image of William the Conqueror because the English do not have a kind opinion of him. But of course, that's beside the point. Yogananda often remarked as to how he himself had been an actual warrior, a warrior who fought battlefields. He was also Ferdinand III. He was William the Conqueror. These are things that he himself shared. And he had all these incarnations of being a warrior. And of course, I'm sure he had many incarnations as a sage and as a saint and as an avatar in many other different forms. but he shared that often with his disciples, perhaps as an indication to how important that warrior quality is for all of us in our own spiritual life. Because as a renunciate, as somebody who's spiritually seeking, that same battle, that same instinct to fight in the battle, to defend our principles, does manifest in our own spiritual life as well. Sometimes we have to stand up with courage for the principles we believe in, even in this world. And even more importantly, we have to fight the tendencies in our own nature. That's in fact the battle that we are looking at in the Bhagavad Gita, this battle that Arjuna is about to fight. Even conquering our own temptation and the lower tendencies that are constantly pulling us downward, that takes the Kshatriya quality, that takes the warrior within us to be able to pick up our sword and be able to do some violence. That's in fact what Krishna is nudging Arjuna to do, to live up to that Dharma of a Kshatriya. In fact, at the end of these verses, that's what Krishna tells to Arjuna. You are a Kshatriya, so it is your moral duty above anything else to pick up the sword and fight this battle. And the battle he's referring to is not just killing those that are against him on the battlefield, but also being able to conquer his own lower nature. Now moving on, verse 44 of the 18th chapter. The duties of a Vaishya by nature are tilling the soil, cattle breeding, and business. Those of a Shudra, that's the next one. Now, the Vaishya caste is an interesting one. A Vaishya caste is also one that's a mixture of the three gunas, but where the rajas is predominant. But as we were discussing in the episode on the gunas themselves, the quality of rajas, the ego-activating quality, can go in either direction. That can be spiritualized if that same ego activation is used in service to the divine, or it can take us towards tamas or darkening of our own consciousness if that is directed downward. A Vaishya is somebody who might have more of a tendency in himself for that ego-activating quality to be drawing him downwards. A Vaishya is defined by self-interest. A Vaishya, I think of the Vaishya as the merchant. That's the best symbol you can use. So far we have seen the sage, the warrior, and now we are looking at the merchant. And by definition, a merchant is somebody who's constantly calculating profit and loss. And profit and loss in what sense? It is profit and loss in the sense of what's benefiting him materially and what's not. So a merchant is somebody who's constantly motivated by self-interest. A merchant may be very smart. A merchant may be very talented and skilled. A merchant may be very, very good at what he does. But his motivation always lies in self-interest, or what we often call in the West, bottom line. That's come to refer to that attitude, almost considered a virtue here in the world that we live in. But that indicates the Vaishya quality of the consciousness constantly needing to think of itself. Swami Kriyananda often, I think it was in Alice in Wonderland, I'm not quite sure, or a different children's fairy tale or some, something from his times. I think he used to quote a character, a spider, that would often say in the Suri, "What's in it for me?" And that is the Vaishya quality. Constantly asking, what's in it for me? What can I get from here? How can I benefit from this? And I have to say, we are talking about, this is something I did not mention, I should have in the beginning. We are talking about caste as if we are all belonging to a certain caste and there's a spectrum that we are moving towards, which in a sense is not entirely untrue. But also, all these four castes exist within us. There is a Shudra, a Vaishya, a Kshatriya, and a Brahmin within us. There are parts of us that we often find to be so perfectly in tune with the divine that we can actually feel that intuition guiding us. There are parts of us where we are able to stand up with courage and do a spiritual battle to do that which is right for us and stand by those spiritual principles. And there are parts of us that are motivated by self-interest. There is a Vaishya within us. So we are working consciously with all these different qualities and citizens in our own consciousness. And this again reiterates something that I was talking about in the gunas. As long as we are on the material plane, as long as we have not completely transcended it or we are not self-realized, we do have all three gunas in us. So it is not to demonize tamas or rajas. It's not to say that we have to completely run away or eradicate all shreds of tamas in our consciousness. It's not possible. There will be a little bit of tamas and rajas that we have to work with constantly, because that's what the material plane is made of. So when we are moving through and working with this plane, we are working with these qualities. I'm saying all this because as I was thinking about this morning in my meditation, you walk into a store, you see bananas in one store for $5, in another store for $7. You know, it is not to say that if you were to now go to the store that had it for $5 and you chose to buy it, it is not to say that you're constantly motivated by self-interest. Yes, we need a little bit of that common sense and groundedness of the material reality, and that requires that nature of being calculative in ourselves to be able to take the right decisions. I'm not, again, this is a very subtle teaching. I'm not trying to make that a virtue. It is a practical skill that we might need in order to move through this material reality. But the Vaishya consciousness itself is something that we are trying to transcend. We are trying to move away from that realm of self-interest. And all these four castes, I'll talk about the Shudras and I'll come to that just in a second. Now the Shudras, those of a Shudra, the Dharma of a Shudra, are service to members to the higher caste. And this is where it gets very tricky. And, when we work with ideas of social justice and oppression, that's why this whole idea of the Dharma of a Shudra being serving somebody of a higher caste in itself starts to sound like oppression. And again, at the risk of sounding like I'm repeating myself 20 times, this is not based on somebody's birth or parentage. And Swami Kriyananda quite categorically, actually Yogananda quite categorically talks about how some souls have newly incarnated on the material plane and others might have inhabited the human plane for hundreds or thousands of incarnations. So in that sense, that consciousness that is entering this human reality for the first time might be a little different from consciousness that is already from this plane. And in a sense, that's what the Shudra is referring to, because when somebody is first getting a hold of that ego awareness and of moving through this plane, one has to first refine themselves enough to develop their skills enough to first come out of the tamas. Because animals, for the most part, as much as it might seem like they have all three qualities in them, their center of gravity most often lies in tamas. The only motivation an animal has to act in this world is often food, survival, mating. These are only natural instincts. These are the only mechanisms through which the animal moves through the world. And if that instinct is satisfied, you would notice, even if you have a pet, I hope I'm not demeaning the animal nature itself, but that is the definition of what being an animal is. If you notice in a cat or a dog, if you happen to have one or if you happen to know an animal closely, you would notice that as soon as that instinct is satisfied, the animal finds no incentive to put out energy. And it's not a bad thing, it's just what the nature of a dog or a cat is. As soon as it is fed, it is not restless. As soon as, or if it becomes restless to physically express, as soon as it is able to express itself, then it's not that way. So it always returns by default to that state of tamas, of a general dull center of gravity, and it is constantly being impelled out of it by its own natural instincts. And that is the secret of nature. Nature itself is impelling that consciousness out of the tamas through these natural instincts. That's why the animals are given their natural instincts. Now, when the soul enters the human plane, there's more than natural instincts that come into play. There is an element of will and there is an element of choice. Humans are also driven by instincts, but we have this interesting element of willpower and choice that are introduced into that picture, by which we can choose whether or not we pursue instincts during all circumstances, or we don't. And that is where we understand the caste of Shudra, which is primarily whose center of gravity lies in tamasic states of consciousness. For them, they have to be impelled out of it through physical activity. And that's often why a Shudra is somebody who's said to be doing work that requires using the physical body. You can think of a Shudra as a laborer, but that is not by any means to mean that somebody who does physical work is Shudra. No, that is not the case. We all have to do physical work, if not for anything else, at least good health. So that's not to say that that is defining one's own caste. But a Shudra is one whose consciousness is centered in tamas, whose center of gravity is in tamas. And if you notice somebody who's that way, their primary motivation to act in this world is generally fear of pain or fear of consequence. And if that impetus does not exist, you would find that they naturally drift into lower states of consciousness. And such people, when their center of gravity is there and fear is the primary motivation because of which they're acting in this world, their consciousness can also tend to have many negative aspects to it that they're constantly working with. Like, for example, stealing could be considered. Somebody who has a propensity to steal perhaps has a Shudra consciousness in them, because how does a thief even work? Even a smart thief, he's working because he's primarily motivated by the fear of being caught in the consequence, and all his calculations and motivations are centered around that. So anyway, I think I've reached the time for today. I want to just summarize before I finish today's webinar, if you have to take something home with you from this discussion on the caste system. The caste is, of course, not defined by birth, and the four castes that we want to recognize and work with are the Brahmins or sages, Kshatriyas or warriors, Vaishyas or merchants, and Shudras or laborers. And the defining quality of the caste itself is the motivation behind action. And that's what Krishna is talking about here. A Brahmin does not have an explicit motivation because he's always in tune and is guided by the divine. His own connection with a higher reality is guiding his thoughts and actions on a moment-by-moment basis. So that question of motivation does not come up as strongly in case of a Brahmin. In case of a warrior, the motivation is principle, the motivation is righteousness. That's what a warrior is motivated by. A Vaishya is motivated by self-interest, and the Shudra is motivated by fear. So when we work with ourselves, when we work with others, it is perhaps helpful to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Why is this person doing that? And recognize this reality of the gunas and the caste behind it, and then learn what is the next step. What is the next step for spiritual growth, for this quality within me, for this quality that is in this other person, and then consciously and sympathetically move in that direction. So friends, I'll see you again next week with another verse from the 18th chapter. Until then, God bless you.